this is a podcast I've been looking forward to for a long time. And we've had it booked in the calendar for like,
Ever.
3 months or something, didn't we?
And I was like, who's this Emma-Louise Boynton girl? I was like, who is she? And then did the research and actually met her.
Did you run into her at Soho House?
Yeah, someone was like, you should meet Emma. She's sitting next to you. She was like making a cup of tea or something. She wasn't actually there. And I was like, oh yeah. And he was like, yeah, she's got this great podcast called Sex Talks.
They do events and stuff as well,
And
if anyone's in London.
Yeah. And I was like, what's her name? And he was like, Emma. And I was like, hey, she's coming on our podcast soon. And then it was like, from there, it was like, hey, I'm Vic. Hey, but yeah. Anyway, and then she keeps sitting next to me. It's kind of awkward. Like
She's blatantly going to be listening to this. So now you're going to feel like...
She actually said the other day, she was like, I promise I'm not just following you. I was like, whatever. You just eye up where I'm sitting and you just beeline it.
Vic and her have like been stealing drawers. Like both of them are hiding all their shit in a random... Oh, okay, sorry. At the co-working space.
No, she is great. She is so fun to have around the office, but also really excited for you to hear this conversation because it was like relating sex and money, and they are two of the most taboo things to talk about, and having her expert knowledge on the sex side of things, ours on money. Honestly, the relatability just like blew my mind.
Yeah. It was such an interesting conversation. We could have done an entire podcast just on, like, honestly, a whole series on sex and money. Woo. Anyway, enjoy. For all of the details to find out what Emma is up to, we will put those in the show notes.
And Soph has no idea what to do with foreskin, just FYI.
Oh my God, I can't believe you just fucking outed me there. We did brush over that in the interview, which I was so grateful for. Both of you were like,
I was just the whole time being like, my parents might listen to this. My parents might listen to this.
I'm really excited to talk about this because I think the conversation of sex and money, it's such a complex relationship. The two of them also totally mutually exclusive as well. But for anyone who doesn't know who you are, the things that you've done, because I think a lot of our listeners are in Australia and New Zealand. So can you give a bit of a like, hi, I'm Emma.
Like an Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've been coming here for...
Hi, I'm Emma, and I've been coming here for 3 years and 2 days and 15 hours.
I'm 3 days sober.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and I am. Yes, my name is Emma-Louise Boynton, and I am a writer, a presenter, and the founder and host of a platform called Sex Talks. Now, Sex Talks exists to engender more honest, open, vulnerable conversations around typically taboo topics, including sex, gender, and the future of intimacy. So we kind of cover a really kind of broad swathe of topics under that kind of intimacy umbrella, I suppose. So really deep diving into sex, relationships in a way that, well, I think that as a society, we now talk about sex a lot. If you didn't realize, sex sells, and it is everywhere in marketing, on TV, Love Island, etc. But I think that the conversation publicly around sex tends to be quite a reductive one, or quite a sensationalized one. So either we talk about sex through the prism of porn or like reality TV, or it's something that ends up being bound up in quite moralizing conversations in politics. There's a lot of kind of hand wringing around pornography, for example, around sex work, etc. And I really wanted better conversations around sex to be having in a public domain after my experience doing sex therapy. I know we'll go into that momentarily, but I just felt looking around, the conversations that we were having around sex just felt so narrow and lacking in the nuance and the vulnerability that I think is actually so important for a topic that is also just so freaking universal.
Isn't it bizarre? It's the same with money, how much uncomfortable, like nervous sweating, and like we're all just so uncomfortable talking about both of these conversations.
Yet we both do both of them and have both of them. And
You
it's
can't
like,
do anything without money. Like, you need money to live in
live.
this world. And also not every single human, but
Most people are
majority
fucking.
are fucking.
Yeah. Well, guess how we got here?
Yeah.
Little secret.
That's true.
It's so,
Oh my God.
Like everybody is here because someone had sex.
Yeah.
And yet
Oh,
it's
I don't want
still-
to think about my...
But it's just,
don't now.
Yeah,
Sorry.
don't put that
God.
image in my
No,
head.
but it's true. There's such taboo about talking about sex and money, yet they're the things that we do all the time.
Well, they make the world go round.
Yeah,
Sex,
literally,
money.
exactly.
Literally,
Oh my God.
money is how we trade.
cannot exist
That
without
is the
it.
currency through which we barter with. It's the way in which we do all transactions, all deals, run all businesses. And sex is how we, one, obviously procreate, and two, how we form deeper, intimate relationships with a person, like or people that we're seeing. These are fundamental tenets of what
And
it means to
having
be
lots
human.
of both is so fun.
That's the goal, to be rich and
Isn't
fucking
it?
loads.
Oh my God, it really is.
Yeah. But I think that's also what I find sex now is such a fascinating topic. And I'm sure the same about money, and that I think that our relationship to sex tells us so much about who we are and how we show up in the world. And I think we can tell so much about our society through the things that we don't talk about as much as through the things that we do. And so for me, it's really interesting. I mean, any sort of like taboo area I find perennially fascinating, because I'm like, why do we have this discomfort around this topic area? Why is there a legacy of hush hush around things that are so fundamental to being human? And I think when you begin to ask those questions and have those conversations, you really get to the heart of, I think, well, how like power functions and who controls what. So
I've definitely noticed in like the last year or so of doing the curve that if something feels uncomfortable, it's like I'm kind of intrigued of why do I feel so uncomfortable talking about this, or approaching this subject or something. Because I think I was like that with money, and then over the last
And sex, I would say.
Yeah, but it's more just like now I just can't understand why everyone doesn't talk about money. So it's like with sex, it's probably the same. It's like, oh, it's a bit uncomfortable, but I'm like, hopefully we get to a point where it's nobody's uncomfortable talking about sex. I don't know. It's just so liberating when you.
do you guys find, because of what you do now, that people now open up to you in a way that they never did before? Because I've definitely found since running Sex Talks, because it's my full-time job, it's what I do the whole time. So when I meet somebody new, a couple months ago I was in Lisbon and I joined this running group and I went running with this random guy, and very, very quickly he's like, so what do you do? And I'm like, well, I run a media platform. And I'm like, how much can I bother to get into it? Anyway, then I had to talk about Sex Talks. The story as to why I set up Sex Talks is a very personal one, to do with my own issues around sex, doing sex therapy. So very quickly we go into quite intimate, personal, vulnerable terrain.
Yeah.
And what I found as a result of that is that people in turn open up really fast. And so because I'm like, here you go, I'm offering this up, I have the wildest conversations with complete strangers who suddenly they're telling me about their relationship to sex, what shaped that when they were a young teen. And like this guy who like traded crypto and was like a kind of finance bro suddenly is telling me about his relationship to his mum and like how he's always had a like fear of intimacy because of his parents' divorce. And so I feel like that by offering that up, so when we do break that taboo, actually in turn people are, I think, so willing and actually eager to then have those conversations.
But that's like, I mean, you're a walking billboard for let's talk more openly about sex, and we're walking billboards for let's talk more openly about money.
Yeah.
And I think you're so right. Everyone is absolutely craving the opportunity to explore and talk about these things. But unless you're given a safe space to talk about it, then you're not going to.
I also think there's the opposite of that, which is the tiny, tiny percent. Like, yes, what we're doing is great and we're encouraging conversation. And then there's also the minority that are like, oh, so money, or like, just like a bit arrogant about it, or a bit like we'll be out at a bar and it was like everyone's like, oh, Vic, so what's your view on Bitcoin? And I'm like, you don't care about my view on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
You just are trying to show your ego, like it's just I don't know, and I feel like you probably might get that as well. It's kind of like, oh, a sex platform, like just a bit.
There's always going to be 2% of judgy
Totally.
energy.
Totally. And I've had that actually. Mostly people want to very quickly tell me about their relationships and their the sex that they're having or not having, and ask more about my relationship sex, which is all completely fine because I feel like I offer it up very quickly. But then sometimes, and this is something that is, I think, also more reflective of the attitudes around sex and the sex kind of world more broadly, is I'll be met with an assumption that, oh, I must be on OnlyFans, I must be a sex
Or a
worker.
goddess in bed. Do you feel like a lot of pressure to live up to that
I was
expectation?
going to say, just really quick on that, but no judgment on anyone who is a sex worker or who does OnlyFans. I like more power to you. But I think the quick assumption that because I have conversations around sex, I must therefore be. I think there's a misunderstanding. But yes, to your point, I really found that because I did
almost like fetishizing you as because you speak about this. Because I've got a friend who works in a similar space, and she finds that people will slide into her DMs or want to talk to her about it just because they're like fascinated by the fact that you're so open about it. It must mean that you tie people up on hooks in your bedroom, and do you know what I mean? It's like there's this.
I remember,
and I think it's similar with you with money.
Yeah,
I think that people, particularly with Vic, are just like, oh, how many houses do you own? Like, how many millions of dollars have you got invested? There's like
I mean, I immediately want to know that. Like, how many hands do you, where should I be investing my crypto? Don't. But I actually think that's more on me though, because I think I did sex therapy and
Can we talk about that?
I think that's probably good because then I will.
I'm like,
the
I
impact that
know.
happened
It's
after
like
that.
dangling the carrot.
Because I've done a little bit of sex therapy, but there will probably be a lot of people listening who have no idea really what that even means.
Yeah,
and also I think therapy has this connotation of you need to have something quote unquote wrong with you to go and sort out. And actually there's so much conditioning that we grow up with around sex and money and relationships and love and everything that I really view therapy in a completely different way. I think that if I could afford to do all different types of therapy all the time, I would love to be doing that. So there's probably a lot of people when they hear sex therapy, they think like, do you have vaginitis or have you got problems with it? It's like, no, actually, I was trying to unwind a lot of stuff that probably most people listening would also benefit from. So could we maybe even just start from where did you find yourself when you thought, okay, I kind of want to explore what's happening here and dive a bit deeper, because it's a brave thing to do and not that many people will have done it. So
yeah, I mean, so I didn't know that sex therapy existed either. I had no idea. And I didn't have that like sudden moment personally of, oh my God, I need to fix this thing. So I was at a dinner party with a group of semi-strangers. It was in that period in which we were coming in and out of lockdown. We were in kind of an out period. And I'd gone to this dinner party and I was talking to these two women and I didn't really talk about sex that much. I mean, I know it's very hard to believe now, but I just wasn't a sexual person and I didn't really enjoy sex that much. So I had a lot of anxiety around sex. I broke up with I had one really long-term boyfriend who I broke up with him like mid-20s, earlier than that actually. And the sex that had been like great, had its issues, but like it wasn't a massive problem. Communication issues, definitely. But it was really after that, I then started dating different people, had one-night stands, and I think it brought up a lot of past quite bad experiences with sex. I was sexually assaulted when I was like 17, as so many women are. I'd had an eating disorder growing up, so I didn't have a very good relationship to my body. And these are all things I didn't really realize that overtly that they were affecting how I showed up in intimacy, but they definitely were. And so I'd go on a date and I would just feel so nervous and anxious about the point at which we'd eventually have sex. I'd be so in my head, and I couldn't orgasm in partnered sex. So I just stopped being able to orgasm basically. So I know you say we don't always have to have a problem to go to therapy. I actually did at that point have what I now understand to be called situational anorgasmia, where in certain situations you're not able to orgasm. And it's a psychosomatic issue in that it's really in your head. Not always, and it'll be different for different people, but for me it was very much in my head. I didn't know any of that. I was at this dinner party saying to these two girls who I just met, I just don't like sex. I'm not a sexual person. I can't come in partnered sex. It's not for me. It's not my thing. And I kid you not, both of them looked at me in horror, and it transpired that they'd actually both gone to see a sex therapist, and the same sex therapist, who's based in Australia. She lived by Bondi Beach, and they'd both become evangelicals for the cause of sex therapy. So they started telling me about their respective experiences. They did it separately, by the way. They're just friends. And how much sex therapy had changed their relationship to sex so profoundly. And one of them just said to me, like, this is something you actually can address. You can change this. And I guess for me, it was a bit of a light bulb moment, because I never thought that my relationship to sex was something that could be changed. I thought it was a static thing that was just bad, that had always been like a bit shoddy, but then in the past like 6 or however many years I wasn't able to orgasm. That was kind of cemented as like just a bad thing. And it wasn't something I needed to address. So they gave me her number, and I love a good business incentive. I then was telling my friend Sharmadine Reed, who I was working with at the time, I was working for her platform, The Stack, and she was like, you need to write a column about this. Write a column called Conversations with My Sex Therapist, and then we'll cover your sex therapy. Great.
Oh my God, amazing.
I know. Because I know.
You're like, okay, I'm going.
Yeah, props to Sharmadine, because it's such a good idea. It's such a great title for a series, for an article series. And it was also the thing that actually made me do it. And I don't think I would have done it otherwise. So I started doing sex therapy over
How much
Zoom.
is a sex therapist, by the way?
I was about to say, God, that needs to be like subsidized.
Yeah. So luckily for me, I didn't pay. It was paid for by The Stack because I was writing about it. So full transparency on that. But I think it was about £80 per session. So it's expensive. But I'd say hella worth it.
But it's so interesting though, return on investment, pretty high. But I think
How much is an orgasm worth?
Yeah. More than £80.
Definitely.
Honestly, I'm like cumulatively, how much should I pay to basically be able to come again?
Yeah, worth it. Worth it. I think the money piece is massive when it comes to therapy. I think there's a lot more people who would pay for any kind of therapy if it was subsidized. And it's unfortunate that sex therapy is not considered. You know, I doubt there'd be any like insurance or like health insurance that would subsidize something like that.
Yeah.
You know what I would say on that though, is that it was really transformative for me, not really in the way I thought actually, in that I started talking to this amazing therapist, Alex, over Zoom, and quite quickly we went into my history of eating disorder, sexual assault, etc. All these things I really hadn't thought of as being critical to my relationship to sex. And she said something to me that has actually fundamentally transformed my relationship to my body in a way I wasn't anticipating. And she said, for as long as you're at war with your body, it's going to be really hard to enjoy sex and really hard to experience pleasure, because at the moment you're just seeing your body as something you're in a constant battle with.
Yeah.
And I was quite badly bulimic since I was 12, and as a result,
that is
like
so young.
So I was a child.
When you look at 12-year-olds
Oh my
now
God,
and you just think, gosh,
You're a baby.
You're an absolute baby.
You're an absolute child. And that's when I first started developed an eating disorder, and then I was anorexic, and then I was bulimic, and I just hadn't acknowledged that was part of my life because I'd become physically better and I didn't like look ill anymore. Like when you're anorexic, people are always worried about you, and it's actually quite burdensome, even though I get it. But then after that, I didn't realize how disordered my relationship to food and to eating was, and to exercise. And also the fact I was bulimic was just this thing. It was like this, I mean, talk about taboo. Bulimia is freaking taboo. Anorexia, in a culture that still lauds being skinny and associates thinness with discipline, being thin and being anorexic, there's a kind of weird, fucked up kind of glamour to it, especially now. We're seeing like the whole Ozempic craze, etc. But bulimia is gross. It's messy. It's disgusting. Like, it's not something you want to talk about. So I didn't talk about it. I didn't tell anybody. Anyway, this all came up in the sex therapy room, and it really forced me to confront the fact that I had made myself really unsafe in my own company, in that when I'd spend an evening on my own, I'd spend that evening cooking and then throwing up. I didn't know how to be on my own and look after myself. I didn't know how to just be kind to myself in a really basic way. We talk a lot about self-care now. I had no real meaningful, active way of caring for myself personally. And so we started off on some quite small tasks. She said to me, like, you need to learn to seduce yourself. You need to learn to become safe in your own company, and not just safe, but actually luxuriate in your own company. You need to build that sensual, sexual relationship with yourself first and foremost before you even think about what that would look like with a partner. But to go back to your point, the reason I wanted to say all of that is that the therapy aspect of it was so important to me, because it was the first time in my life that I was talking to someone openly and honestly about my relationship to my body and my relationship to sex. And it was in a shame-free environment, because I'd carried so much shame around the eating disorder. It was like my dirty little secret. And you wouldn't have guessed. You would not know. I'm super confident. I'm really bubbly. Bubbly is such an awful word, but you know what I mean. You know,
she's so bubbly.
She's so vivacious.
She just
and you're like,
bounds into the office.
Yeah, she must be so annoying. Probably so. But
I reckon there's so many people that have described me as bubbly.
I know. I probably do.
It means well, but it is just like,
it's awful. It's a terrible one. But I was like, you would never guess. I'd then like, was at a dinner and I'd be like, so freaking bubbly. And then I'm going home to make myself sick. It just was so incongruent with my external personality. So it was just kind of this private shame. The same thing with sex. When I talked about sex, all my friends, and this is probably true about money as well, for as far as I was aware, all my friends were having amazing sex all the time. They were having great sex. They had no anxiety around sex. They would be able to have one-night stands, meet someone, give them a blowjob. And I was there like, how are you not racked with anxiety every time you get naked?
Oh my God, it's
someone?
exactly the same with money. You just think
everyone's
rolling in
rich.
it, got their finances sorted, on their way to their goals. And
well, it's similar to how externally you look a certain way, but you
Yeah.
have no idea what's under the surface. Like you could be
surface.
driving an Audi, but in debt up to your eyeballs, or
Yeah.
you could be rolling around in the most beautiful clothes, but you can't afford them because you're on Afterpay.
or wearing absolutely like shit cheap clothes
And
and
be
driving a shit
rolling in
box car, but they're saving 80% of your salary.
And
like
actually, I'd say more now than ever because of social media. The exterior is how we typically judge people through the lens of their social media.
Yeah.
And I think now, like, I sometimes think this about me. Like, outwardly, I get very luckily I get kind of some free things because of what I do. maybe I'll get invited
If
to
you
like
have
a
any
cool
spare
party.
vibrators and you want to
Oh my
chuck
God,
them
yes,
my
I
way,
can definitely
please let me know.
But like I definitely get invited that probably looks exactly like I have loads of money, like I have loads of cash, but like I'm not paying for that, and I don't know, like the business is doing well, we're doing good, but I want no money. Like I pay all my money goes on the business, on on them paying freelancers and stuff. So I just think now more than ever there's a kind of incongruence with the external version of ourselves that we portray and put forward online and the reality behind the scenes. And I think that's very true with both sex and with money. But what I want to say just on the therapy thing,
can you tell she's got ADHD too? You know how we do the whole like, we've got a point and then we go this way and then we go this way.
We're going to finish it. But I just want to say some of the science
No,
of
I'm
therapy.
here for it. Like, I think it's, and also, can I just say, like, it's so refreshing and amazing to hear someone that has spent the time looking at their own sex story and can then communicate that for other people, because I do think it is similar as well to the way that we talk about money. If you can show someone, this is where I was, and now through doing the work, I've ended up here. It's the same with money. Like, you're not going to just be able to figure out your relationship with your finances in a couple of days or listening to 3 podcasts.
It takes
we
work.
have built this relationship with ourselves for 32 years. So it's going to take a while to unwind it. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
And it's really interesting. The next therapy I'm going to get is money therapy, because I need to unpack that. But just on the sex therapy front, it was really important for me to be in that context of doing sex therapy. And yes, it is quite expensive. It's £80 a session. But what I would say is that what was so transformative ultimately was getting used to talking about sex and talking about it in that shame-free, open environment. And I think there are other ways of doing that. It doesn't have to exclusively be in the context of therapy. And what I mean by that is, I think when it comes to the more kind of traumatic eating disorder, sexual trauma, there's stuff there that I think you really benefit from having a professional, definitely, where you can unpack those things in a way in which someone's created a safe space. They have the correct toolkit to kind of help you process those things. You might not be able to offer it up all at once, etc. But I think for a lot of people, and Dr. Karen Gurney actually says that she's an amazing sex therapist. You can all buy her book called Mind the Gap, and she's got a new book coming out next month. But she talks about the fact that most people don't actually need sex therapy, but do need to get more comfortable talking about sex. So she says, listen, I'm trying to do myself out of a job, but she was like, a lot of people who come through my therapy room door don't need to be there. What their problem is, they just need to get better at communicating around sex. And that doesn't have to always be in the therapy room. So if you're someone that's thinking, God, I really would like to improve my relationship to sex. I have, shame around sex. A lot of that can be like religious-based shame, gender-based shame, previous traumas, etc. Or you're someone who has just never really felt they found their kind of true sensual self. I think there's a lot that you can do that doesn't incur the cost of going to see a sex therapist every single week. But you can listen to podcasts, go to events, come to sex talks, obviously. And I think actually it's the act of getting comfortable with thinking and talking about sex in an unshameful way can be transformative in and of itself.
I went to see a psychic, it was like 6 months ago. And it's funny, some people were like, oh.
It's really off-brand for Vic, can I just say? Like, randomly, she'll be like, I've seen a psychic. And I'm like, I love that for you, but I'm also like, where did this come from?
Off-brand. No, she was recommended by a friend of ours.
Is it the same one you saw when you broke up with your boyfriend like a few years ago? Is it the same?
No, definitely. Oh, yeah. She just kept telling me the same stuff, and I was like, do you just rinse and repeat? Anyway, this one, and she was like, she told me a lot about like relationships and everything, and then she was like, I think you need to go to a tantra sex class. And I was like, absolutely not.
And then Vic sends me a link. She's like, I've got to go to a tantra sex class. Will you come with me?
I was like, will you come with me? And then I was like, is it more awkward to go with a friend? Or like, what are we going to be doing? Are we going to be like hugging or like on like, I was just like, I have no, and the thought, I still haven't booked because I'm like, absolutely not. I'm like, the thought
Let's
of booking.
all go. I want to go.
I would love to go.
But see, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be having orgasms in front of
people. Not how it works.
I know, but this is the thing. I think it's my ignorance. It's the fact that I haven't spoken about sex with, or had open conversation about sex, so that it's such a gigantic.
It's a scary door to walk through.
And it's exactly the same with money. It's like, oh gosh, no, I don't even want to open that box because I don't even want to know what I don't know or what I need to know or what I can improve on. I don't know.
And I think what you said about the way in which people can explore the idea of talking about sex to open up their minds and comfortability with it in general, I think you can use that exact same framework if it comes to trying to improve your relationship with money, because if you just say to a friend, hey, do you have shame around talking about XYZ? Or, hey, have you ever asked anyone what they earn? Or do you invest and do you feel comfortable having a conversation about
Do
it?
you have credit card debt? Or like, have you like had a blowout on the weekend ever where you're like, got a budget but then you don't stick to it? Or like, just people go like, oh, of course, all the time. It's like, oh my gosh, okay, good.
I actually always ask people how much they earn and how much their salary is, how much I
love that.
really do enjoy asking the questions that
I'm exactly the same.
Like, typically make people feel quite uncomfortable. Not because I want to make someone else feel uncomfortable. That's never ever my intention. But I'm genuinely curious about how much people make, and especially working when you run your own business. I've always been freelance or run my own business, but there is such a lack of transparency around how much people make and the kind of deals that people are making. And when you don't have the infrastructure of a company behind you, there is no way for you to get more information and get those like kind of financial details that maybe you would have in the context of a company where there's maybe like a pay grade system or something that there's some degree, I don't know how much the truth, I've never worked for a big company permanently, but there must be like more like a little bit more visibility, you'd hope. Whereas when you work for yourself, you really have to figure everything out on your own. So I've so gotten into the habit of asking people all the time, like, what is your salary? Or like, how much did you get sponsorship for? Or like, how much did that cost you? And I think the more you get comfortable with asking those sorts of questions, you also give people the space to then ask you in return. And it's the same around sex. Like, we're all, as we said at the start of this conversation, sex and money are things that we all are having to grapple with daily, basically. And
I
no,
wish
it is
I was
really daily, even if you're not
grappling with sex daily.
Yeah, I mean, but even if you're, but you may not be having sex. I mean, don't have sex daily. But
Sorry,
like,
miss, I've had 1 week off of sex. Like, God, chill out. He'll be here in a second. God.
But don't you reckon when you start having it again and then you realise,
oh my God,
holy shit, I forgot how fun it is.
Oh my God.
Like, it's so weird how I think if you don't practice your own, like, whether, you know how you said seduce yourself and get used to like buying beautiful lingerie and just dancing in front of a mirror and putting like lovely candles and good music on and actually feeling safe in your own company. I think unless you're doing that in between being with people, like having a partner sexually, I reckon my sex drive completely disappears. Like, I forgot what sex is.
You're like, I don't need it. Oh,
My
No,
God.
I needed it.
Like, I was in a Pilates class the other day and the spring was going in and out of the thing. And honestly, I was like, I'm so horny. Like, but there would be a time where that would not have even crossed my mind. Do you know what I think is a good like way to relate that to money as well, is that we're quite unconscious in the way that we spend money and the way that we use our wallets and our cards and everything. We're really disconnected from the emotional piece that connects how you spend with then how you feel. And I think that it's really true what you're saying about that relationship with your own body with relationship to sex, but it's also exactly the same when you're thinking about, like, often I spend money and it makes me feel so anxious, or I'm the total opposite and I'm like, God, I felt so good. That was such a highlight of my week and I felt really empowered by it. And I think that there's a really interesting piece between both of these conversations with sex and money where like the same concept can be applied. If you just tune into your body and how you feel doing something, what you learn about what makes you happy or sad or anxious, like you learn from those things.
How do we make those conversations more open and have them in much more like comfortable environments? Like, what were some tips amongst friends or your partner, or, you know, apart from going to sex therapy, like what tips do you have to make people comfortable?
So when it comes to sex specifically, and I think you probably apply the same thing to money, is I think first and foremost, it's really basic, but it is just like beginning to have those conversations, to broach them with friends, to broach them with a partner. And something that always comes up at sex talks, honestly, like pretty much every single session. So we do a Q&A at the end and people always ask, how do I tell my partner I don't like the sex we're having? How do I...
Sorry, but can we just pause?
Yeah.
Can you imagine if you haven't said that for 5 years?
Yeah,
and then,
I can. 100%. Because that's...
And you assume that's just, well, this is how it is. And
and you don't think to question it. And also you don't want to broach it because you don't want to offend them.
Oh my gosh.
So something like that. So very, very common. Also like mismatched desire, which is really commonplace.
Oh my God, this is actually like, I reckon we could take every every sex word out of this podcast and replace it with money. Like it's even.
Can you relate it back to that? I would love to hear.
No, in terms of it's uncomfortable. It's like you don't want to talk about it, so you just like go with status quo. You know, if you're splitting things 50-50 or if they're paying for everything, but you don't want to rock the boat, you don't want to have that conversation, you don't want to talk about your goals and shared values and like you.
So true.
And also, gosh, I reckon so many people would be intimate with someone before they even have a conversation with money. You know, like you get someone to know every inch of your body before you know how much they earn.
Some people have kids without even talking about what
But
their
also, I
husband
think
earns.
also people probably get really
wife.
intimate, have kids before talking about sex.
Yeah.
So they're
exactly.
probably not
Yeah.
talking about
Yeah.
it, like because we don't. And Emily Nagoski is an amazing sex therapist and has wrote the Bible around female pleasure specifically called "Come as You Are,"
Oh, I've
which
read
was
it.
published. Have you read it?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
good.
yeah.
Like 10 years ago, it's published now. But she says that people are. We really need to question our sex culture when people are more comfortable just having sex and actually being able to talk about it. And that's the same with money. It's just these things that we're doing, like, because it's unavoidable. We're not like, most of the time you can't avoid having sex. I mean, you can, and totally, if some people are asexual, that is totally fine. But most people are having sex at points of their life, and we're all spending money. Like, you gotta spend money. We live in a capitalistic society. So these things, we're doing these things, we're going through the motions, but we're not acknowledging the processes that surround them, our relationship to them, how we feel, to earlier points, Sophie. We're not like confronting what that relationship to money, what that relationship to sex, what that's based on, like what that's been informed by. And we're not like exploring that relationship, thinking, how could this relationship be better?
And we're not thinking that it could be better.
It could be better,
It's like,
exactly.
imagine if we talked about money and actually combined our values and our goals and achieved something better, or like, you know, like combine both of our expertise. And same with sex. Like, imagine if we opened up and talked about it and discussed what we both wanted to make this like bigger and better. And like, I'm just like,
It's like, I'm really increasingly doing lots more like research and interested in intimacy and how intimacy is evolving in a very digital world in which we're so used to having so many of the conversations that we have day to day mediated through technology, and what that's doing to our capacity for intimacy, in-person intimacy. And I remember Chloe McIntosh, who runs the sex platform Karma, said this once in a talk. She was like, we're seeing with younger people, they're so used to everything being digital that when it comes to then having sex, they have no idea how to communicate vulnerably or intimately in an environment which they're like lying naked with somebody, which is completely understandable. But I think when it comes to like, it's such a form of intimacy to be able to talk to someone about your body and their body and how it feels, and money. Like those are really, though, because they're still, I guess, taboo laden topics, it's such a deep form of intimacy to be able to go there with somebody.
yeah.
But I think we lose out on so much when we don't. And I saw something the other day, or there was maybe it was just an article, maybe it's like sometime this week, of someone saying, I would never tell my partner how much I earn, and I would never have like and then get married. I would never like tell them my salary. And I'm just thinking, if you're choosing to build your life with somebody and you are entering into what is also fundamentally a like economic institution, aka marriage, to then not have the visibility on your respective earnings, I find like that's a key form or element of intimacy that you're completely overlooking the importance of, and I imagine really ignoring at your peril.
Really bizarre. Like,
Yeah.
if you
But
actually stop and think about it, it is absolutely bizarre.
It is. But then I also thought that because I was then obviously thinking about that sex, like imagine if you went in and you didn't explore sex and intimacy with a partner. But then I thought, and this is why I do want to also do money therapy, I can totally imagine doing that. I can imagine not wanting to tell a romantic partner like the truth behind my income, and mainly because I don't know.
But I reckon the
I'm
reason
so
that but I think, would you feel like that if you're talking about the truth behind your sexual experience?
Sex, fine.
See,
now,
that's what I mean though, is I think
but
because
money,
you're
no.
used to it.
But that's what I mean. Yeah, but
Because I feel
it's
comfortable.
learnable.
Because
Yeah,
what I mean
it's
is
like-
I feel
Yes,
really
yes,
comfortable
it's
talking
learnable,
about
totally.
my like money situation
Yeah.
and what I earn and all of that now, but I'm still dipping my toes into the
into
sex
sex
side of
side.
things. And I do think it's just like what Vic asked before, like how can we actually increase these, like the frequency of these conversations and the depth of them and learn from each other. It's just having them.
Oh, so now what?
But how do you like if
So-
I'm sitting with my partner
Yeah.
and I'm like unhappy in my sex life?
So, okay,
I'm
so-
not, but like just FYI.
So this does come up all the
How-
time.
yeah.
So it comes up all the time in sex talks. And the thing that most sex therapists have said to me in an interview is that thing with these conversations, if it's the first time you're broaching a conversation about sex with a partner, it's obviously quite heightened. Like it's going to be, you're not used to it. It's going to feel quite galling, perhaps. First of all, don't do it in an environment in which you're having sex. So often people would think like, okay, you're actually going to wait until you're like naked and you're fucking to be like, by the way, I actually don't like this way of doing it. Like, that's quite...
You've done this way for like 5 years, but now I'm actually like...
Obviously, in the moment, if something doesn't feel good, you should say like, that I don't like that. Can you do something different? But I think if it's if it's a bigger point about the way that you
I don't
do
like
have
that.
sex...
Can you do something different? Like, I just
don't like your
like now I'm like, no, I'll like pull your hand out, do this, do that. Because also someone, I think we have to give the other person the opportunity to respect our boundaries and to give
love
us
it when
pleasure.
I get told like
Same,
I like that. I'm like, oh, thank goodness.
Tell
I'm like,
me
okay,
what
I
to
don't
do.
have to
I
like
don't know.
yeah.
I can't
do the
mind
foreskin.
read
There's too much of it, you know. Like, well, I'm like, do I hold it tight? Do I not? Like, I really appreciate
tell
someone
me,
being like,
yes.
this is actually how I like it. I'm
Then
like,
I
perfect.
also, and I think the same with the people you're sleeping with. Like, I really, I don't want to mention anyone personally, but I think I've been really pleasantly surprised by the willingness and openness of people I've slept with, not all, but some, to be like, tell me what you like, and to really like, wow, to like act on what I say. But sorry, to go back to the thing about how do you broach this conversation. So first of all, not in a high vulnerability, high octane environment, like actually having sex. So outside that context. And then to be able to bring it up in a way that doesn't feel so kind of confrontational or loaded. So maybe saying something like, oh, you know what? I listened to this podcast the other day, and they were talking about the relationship between sex and money. And I'd never really thought about my relationship to sex. I'd never really thought that actually I feel quite a lot of shame about my body, like naked. And then I actually got down a bit of a research hole. And so you bring it up in that way. So it's saying like, oh, I've got really curious about this thing because it's not something I've thought about before.
Yeah.
But there's kind of a third party you'll bring in. Oh, maybe you'd enjoy this podcast too. Hey, is this something that we could explore together? So you make it something that it's like, you know, you're bringing your partner into that discussion and being like, oh, I'm super curious about this. Can we work on this? Or then, I listened to a kink podcast and they were talking about how role play can be a really amazing way of helping you get out of your head and into your body when it comes to
oh my God, I
sex and
really
intimacy.
want to explore that, but I just
think I'd start laughing.
same.
I don't know if I could do. All my sexual fantasies in my head.
I even find dirty talk like
Oh,
I'm like,
same.
Yeah, I know, same. I know, but I
I
can't.
know.
And the same though, I want to get into it, but then especially, I far out. But I also think maybe there's something in that. Like if you're having those, if you're able to laugh, like that is kind of beautiful, don't you think?
I also think it's so dependent on your partner, whether like whoever it is you're doing that with, your sexual partner, whether that's a long-term relationship or not. And I think there's so many people, I haven't slept with that many people, but there are people I've slept with, Mars, like there's like no way in hell that I would like feel comfortable enough to be able to even entertain the idea of role play, dirty talk, anything. And then I've met people then who I'm like, actually, you make me feel so comfortable and so at ease. And there's this there's a playfulness in the sex that we have that makes me feel like, oh, actually, I can actually imagine being able to do anything with you because it doesn't feel like this is a kind of very performative thing. Or like there's a performativity is joyful.
And there's no judgment.
There's
and
no
it's
judgment,
almost like
exactly.
if you're comfortable having those conversations, I also think it depends on the person. If you're opening up to them of like what you have discovered and what you want to try or what you wanting to learn about yourself, if they're confrontational, if they're just like, nah, absolutely not, or like not open to it, I think that's probably a big red flag.
Totally.
And it's exactly the same with money. It's like if you're like, look, like how much do you earn? Or like, can you, and they're like, oh, I'm not telling you. Or like there's a wall that goes up. It's like, okay, why is there such a red flag? Why is there such resistance to
But also
these
using the exact same thing that you said about talking about sex, finding context to talk about money.
Totally. Yeah.
Whether it's
Yeah.
a podcast, so don't bring it up when you're splitting a bill. Something I would love to talk about is the combination of earning money for sex or exchanging sex for money or the space of sex workers and how it is so incredibly demonized in society, and comparing that to other ways we use our body to earn money. How can we reframe that conversation or at least encourage people listening to think about it differently? Because I know that my perception on sex workers is warped and needs some serious love and attention, but I don't really know how to explore that as a concept. And I imagine that's something you've met a lot of sex workers and people who are in that industry. How can we look at that with different eyes?
I think first and foremost, like speak to people who work in the industry. If you don't know anyone who is a sex worker, there are so many podcasts now where you can listen to a sex worker talk about what they do. And I think a lot of time when we demonize individuals, when we kind of scapegoat people, and that's always really what's happening actually. It's a scapegoating of a sex worker as being like the cause of sexual issues, which they are not. Oftentimes that happens because we just don't, it's born out of ignorance. We just don't really know much about who they are. And then I think sex workers particularly have been so, like sex work broadly has been so sensationalized in the media that I think it's just important to hear from people whose job it is, who are doing sex work, and hear from them what their experience is and why they got into it and what they're doing. And I think there's so many amazing podcasts and resources that people can go to. But I think there is still so much stigma around sex work. And I actually interviewed Sarah Pascoe, the comedian, the other day for Sex Talks. And she's just written a book, she wrote a book a few years ago called Sex, Power, Money. And she said,
I feel like I remember seeing you read this book.
Yes. Oh my God, I've been carrying around the office for like a week. Like seriously, I'm desperately trying to finish this book for the interview.
Just before the interview, she's
honestly, I'm like there, like trying to, they're just constantly trying to consume so much information, but not feeling like it's going in. But with this book, I asked at the beginning, like, kind of how much of your view on sex work specifically, and then the issues kind of surrounding it, did you were challenged in the process of writing this? And she said from the absolute get-go. And I thought her individual story, I think, is kind of quite symptomatic of how a lot of us come to think about sex work. So she is a card-carrying feminist and has been since day dot. And she said that as a result, her view on sex work was very much coloured by pretty like quite a second wave feminist thinking that sex work is inherently exploitative and it kind of props up patriarchy because it's women being compelled due to economic circumstances that may be in to use their body and basically to be abused and exploited by men. And so that was kind of her, like the background, her kind of like feminist feeling that sex work therefore was something that we need to protect women from what is a instrument of patriarchy. And she said as soon as she started writing the book and actually speaking to sex workers, that feminist stance was completely challenged because she was like, yes, you can be against sex slavery. Not you can be, you should be. Like sex slavery is one thing. But too often, especially within media discourse, sex slavery, aka when people are forced into sex work, is conflated with sex work. As she spoke to us, I have lots of people who are actively choosing to be a sex worker, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's one of the oldest professions that humans be able to do. And to your point, Sophie, like there are lots of different professions in which people use their bodies in a very physical way, which have like physical impacts on us that aren't demonized in that same way as sex work.
Influencers, like, sorry to use like a very obvious one, but people,
like bikini influencers,
like, what is
or
the
like,
difference? You're being paid to put that, you know, what you feel comfortable making money through is not going to be the same as how everyone else feels comfortable
even
making
athletes
money.
are using their bodies, like
100%,
and
and putting them,
actors and like
And I think there's definitely, I guess, the thinking within the feminist kind of second wave discourse around sex work, I disagree with it, but I understand. The idea was that there's a very specific risk associated with sex work in that the capacity to be raped, there's a very, I guess the risk associated is a very potentially traumatic one. But ultimately, it's not for anyone to decide how someone else should use their body and what makes someone else feel empowered. What makes me feel hot and sexual and empowered is going to be totally different to what makes you feel hot, sexual, and empowered. So why should we judge anyone for how they choose to use, and not even just use, but celebrate their body?
And I think separating that from like sex slavery and sex workers and people that don't want to be there and don't want to do that but are forced into it, I think is very different, because in my mind, it's all about control and possession, but I'm very much thinking of sex slavery and not sex work. But it's the same, and I think that's for a lot of people is that it's men controlling women, and it's the same with money. It's men controlling women by keeping them in secrecy and not talking about money and not giving them the freedom to have their own money or spend their money how they want.
Or make educated decisions to look after themselves, whether it comes to sex or money. I would love to talk about that, like the patriarchy in terms of how that power has been taken away from us when it comes to sex and money. Why is it so important for these conversations to be brought out of the shadows? Because how will it then benefit us as women to take that power back? Because just to what you're saying, Vic, I think like maybe you finish.
Yeah, well, it's just like with OnlyFans, for example. Like I loved that because it was power back to the female in terms of what they charge, what they put on there. You know, like it's not that forced control element, whereas if you're working for someone that gets that. So I think
and I think I think OnlyFans has had a really massive impact on our broader social view on sex work. It's kind of brought it more into, I guess, just more kind of part of the public conversation. I think OnlyFans is kind of legitimized it a bit more, just slightly like helped like remove that taboo. I think it's become so much more complex. There was just an article in the FT actually, I think a week and a half ago, with the CEO of OnlyFans discussing OnlyFans as a platform, and obviously you answered questions about the sexual content, but also the content on the platform more broadly. There was another piece in Days magazine just a few days ago talking about how reality TV stars, there's a growing kind of more obvious pipeline between doing reality TV and going on OnlyFans. So I think there is more of a kind of conversation around sex work by way of OnlyFans that's kind of maybe helping to break down the taboo a little bit. But the thing is, even with something like OnlyFans, like we saw in October 2021, OnlyFans came out and said they were actually going to stop all sex content that was being made on the platform. I don't know if you remember this.
That's right. Yeah.
And it was because there was an issue with the credit card companies who were saying they no longer would allow OnlyFans to use their credit card payment systems if they had sex like workers on the platform. And like sex workers have made OnlyFans. OnlyFans is big because of sexual content on there. So it was this real, and there was a huge pushback, as there should have been, of people saying like, this is insane. Like we have built, like sex workers have built this platform. You cannot now ban us from the thing that we've essentially made successful. And quite quickly they did row back on it. But what that situation highlighted was just how complicated this terrain is, because the credit card companies have a huge role in this, in that it's really hard to earn money through sex because of the payment system. So for example, with pornography, I interviewed Vex Chambers, who runs a porn platform called Four Chambers. And she said that setting up a payment system for that is basically impossible. They get denied left, right, and centre.
It's like with us. We tried to set up a bank account and they're like, what do you do? We're like, financial education. They're like, oh, you're pretty risky.
Yeah.
What if you accidentally give advice? Or what if you get... And I was like, we're financial education. It's like, oh my, get up with the play.
Yeah.
You know, it's like...
It's so old school.
Welcome to the real world.
Yeah,
There's
but
lots
then
of diverse industries that do creative things. Like
and now imagine someone saying we make, porn. And like they imagine the reaction of the... But then, and she's creating a platform where she also pays her porn performers fairly. She's like paying everyone set. In order to create a better porn industry, everyone needs to be paid. But if you have an issue getting paid, you really limit also independent porn creators from growing. So then we just have these huge monopoly companies that then end up having this kind of basically running the whole porn industry, or not all of it, but having a huge taking up most of the space in the porn industry because they have that leverage of being that size. So I think there's so many hurdles that people who work in the sex space have to confront because of how the social taboo around sex, and specifically sex work, has been ingrained within our financial system and our political system as well. So it's difficult from a financial perspective, for example, the credit card thing. There's also constantly this like moralizing political debates in Parliament that like there's this hand ring around like all porn is really bad. We need to stop telling kids about, how to give blowjobs, which is like is so far from what's happening in what is quite pitiful sex education. So there's just so many ways in which our public conversation around sex is being stymied by this like hangover, this like legacy of the taboo around sex.
And I think that'll take so long to change, like that will take generations, which unfortunately, like I wish it would happen sooner. But I think when you've got generations of people that have been taught this or educated about this or, have a view of a certain thing in a certain way, like unteaching that takes a long time. And it's the same with money. Like it's like, we're considered oversharers and like, oh my gosh.
But why is there so much shame with money and sex? I don't understand why.
It's like control.
But
it's
can we talk about that? Because I think it sounds so obvious to say it's control and knowledge is power. But why as women are we the ones that are often so shafted, excuse the pun, but like from the fact that these two particular taboo conversations, we've been told they're taboo, we've been told not to talk about them. And how does that disempower us without us realizing?
The question is really, why do we have patriarchy? Because money and sex, we said at the beginning, are like the two key things. Literally money and sex make the world go round. And we live in a patriarchal society where women have only in very recent history been able to open a bank account, take contraception so they don't get pregnant every time they have sex. We have only recently been allowed to go to university, get an education, go into work. So we've only very recently been permitted to enter the public space, to have sex without the rest of our lives being, governed by children, and to have our own income so that we can spend and we can make decisions based on
We've only recently been able to have a little bit of freedom.
Exactly.
It's like we're kind of coming out from the bloody caves or whatever, like it's honestly, it seems so archaic.
Exactly. If you think of the broad swathe of history, how small a little pocket of history this is, where women have actually had this forms of liberation, really. And then you look back, therefore, to answer your question, Sophie, if you look back at history, well, who's benefited from women not having access to money and women not being sexually liberated and being like a patriarchal system?
I know who.
Me. And and by the way, whenever I say anything like this, I do. I'm not saying like all men are shit and it's terrible, like men are. But we have lived, inarguably, in a patriarchal system where men have been designated with a very specific role, which in itself is problematic because they've been compelled, like shipped off to war. They've had to be the breadwinners, etc., etc. Like patriarchy doesn't really benefit anyone.
No, I think it's really important. I actually really love that you've brought that up, because I do think, because we've recently realised there's actually quite a few guys that listen to this podcast, which I'm so stoked about. But I think it is really important to say, like, yes, there's some men that have benefited from patriarchy and some that are really pro it, but it's also not across the board. And I think,
and it's not anyone's fault. Like it's not like we're blaming anyone. It's more just like, be aware of why society is the way it is and
where we've come from.
But how much further we've got to go.
Exactly. And I also think it's important. The church also plays a big role in this, because think of how much the church has been the church has basically been the custodian of social morality for so much of history. And the church has a whole lot of stuff to deal with when it comes to sex. The kind of puritanicalism, but then also there's the religious dictates around sex and relationships and sexuality, which are honestly like so fictional. They're like man-made. The misreading of religious texts, is kind of, the really kind of summarized history. But the church has played a big role in then creating quite a very kind of moral framework around sex. For example, the Catholic Church, like sex being specifically for children, women being seen, like depicted in the Bible as being needing to be like kind of puritanical, and like a good woman is virginal and puritanical. Women who like the Virgin Mary. The fact that Mary was deemed a virgin, I'm like, it's just not how it works. She ain't that. This is immaculate conception.
Mary, she would have been like, oh shit, I had sex and I wasn't meant to. I promise I haven't. This is a miracle, baby.
I'm a virgin.
Exactly. And I think so that, and it, even like the story around the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve eating the apple from the tree, like she is the first example of sin and badness, and women are these like corrupters of morality, and our sexuality is so bound up with that. Like we're these temptresses, and that's our sexuality needs to be reined in, because otherwise like we're going to corrupt men as well. It's all such bullshit, but it all carries so much cultural currency and weight, and has such a big influence on how a society see sex and also see our kind of gender relationship with sex. So to go back to your question, Sophie, around kind of why sex is so taboo, I just think that it's deep diving into the history of patriarchy, which is the history of society and culture, and going, I actually just interviewed Nona Aronowitz, who's written a book called Bad Sex, and her mum was a very prominent second wave feminist in the 60s, radical feminist, pro-sex radical feminist. And in this book, Nona grapples with what it was kind of a lot of her mum's writings around the free love movement, around kind of the sexual revolution that happened in the 60s and 70s, and she provides a really interesting socio-cultural history of that period and how transformative it was for women and our relationship to sex, and then the legacy of that kind of pro-sex movement and what that's meant now. And she gives really interesting context, and now like kind of given kind of a kind of hookup culture, app-facilitated sex culture now, how much of that is a legacy of like the feminists synonymizing sexual freedom with women's empowerment, and is that always a good thing? question mark above that. So it's a really good resource for anyone who is interested in kind of going a little bit deeper into that kind of control element and the power dynamics that have always been wrapped up in our relationship to sex and concurrently to money, because it's obviously the sexual revolution was off the back of women's liberation, and that was women being able to finally go out to vote and to earn money to go into the workforce. These things are so interrelated.
So interrelated. Like, honestly, I kind of didn't realize. Like, I'm always like, when I talk about sex and money, I'm like, oh, they're so related. But it's like when you actually dig into it, I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to go out and talk and have more
sex conversations.
Yeah,
it's true.
Yeah,
gosh, honestly, I just feel like this is a whole podcast in itself. Like, the relationship between sex and money is just so deep. I feel like I've learned a lot though, and there's probably quite a few people who have listened to this and want to know if they want to learn more about what you do and the work. I mean, maybe even in our show notes for this podcast, we could put a couple of key resources that have been mentioned, because there's been some really interesting.
So many books. I know. I want to re-listen and take notes. I'm like, there was so many podcasts and books you mentioned. I'm like, oh, amazing.
I do end up coming off with like a bibliography.
It's great.
I like, because I interview so many people. I'm like constantly.
You have a great memory. I'm more like, this one girl, what was her name? You know?
I was thinking, if we could learn something from Emma in this podcast.
We can't even remember our episodes we've talked about. Like, was it episode 22 or 20? Oh my gosh, yeah.
You guys put out so much content, that's why.
But I do think if there's any takeaway from this, it's the idea that yes, that like uncomfortable, prickly, I don't want to go there, which we have all of us with sex and money. As soon as you start to see the results of being brave enough to step into that and over that line that feels really fearful, what comes is going to be positive eventually. Totally. And I just think being brave enough to have these conversations with yourself first and then with those around you is only positive for us and for the collective. So yeah, thank you for opening up.
My pleasure.
Yeah, our eyes towards the sex combo, and I think we probably both need to sidestep away from our money combos.
Let's go and put the tantra workshop.
Also, let's do a joint event on money and sex.
Yes.
How epic would that be? Let's do a sex talks on that.
Sex and money. We could just do this at event.
Yeah.
Could be money talks.
Money talks. Money talks sex.
Money talks sex, Sex talks money.
Yeah. Sex talks money.
Oh, I like it. Gosh,
let's
my
do it.
PR.
Let's do it.